we'll move back to Dr. McKinney to begin our HR Innovations presentation.
Okay. This summer, the district voluntarily underwent a human resources process audit. The audit was focused on several policies, namely AC, Prohibition Against Illegal Discrimination, Harassment and Retaliation, ACA, Sexual Harassment under Title IX, GBCB, Staff Conduct, GBH, Staff-Student Relations, and GBM, Staff Grievances. The district engaged HR Innovations LLC to conduct the independent evaluation and audit of all processes, investigation procedures, and handling of these cases. Here tonight to summarize the findings from the audit is Ken Rosix, President of HR Innovations, and I'll turn it over to Ken at this time.
So just a little background. I do a lot of, since I've retired, I do a lot of consulting work, actually mainly for your school district attorneys, which I believe two with Keeney. And I'm usually not here in open session with the Board of Education. Like, unfortunately, most of my work is with actually investigations under policy AC and ACA. So I just want to say it's a pleasure here to come and present these findings to you today. I just want to back up a second too and say that Dr. McKinney and his HR staff, and actually everybody that assisted me, I requested a lot of information that's on a slide later that we'll get to. We're very accommodating. I mean, very gracious, very hosting, very open, and wanted me to see everything, really, the A to Z about what's going on so that I can make some recommendations and reports. So I just wanted to note that for you as we go through. I believe Dr. McKinney already mentioned the main policies that I looked at, the district policies, policy AC, which is specifically the prohibition against illegal discrimination, harassment, and retaliation, policy ACA, which is sexual harassment under Title IX, and then that crossed over into some G policies, which are the personnel policies for the district, GBH, the main one, staff-student relations, and then, of course, staff conduct, which is GBCB, and staff grievances, GBM, as you see there. Next slide, if you don't mind. Here is the slide about all the information that I requested, all right? As part of the policy, the findings that we'll get to in a moment, one of the main things that I did around policy AC and ACA, they have required training. And so I looked at a lot of the trainings that you have, the annual mandatory trainings. You might have heard that term, annual mandatory trainings. If there's any staff in the room, they love the annual mandatory trainings, I'm sure. And so I looked at that for compliance issues and whether it was actually meeting the training requirements that we'll get to in a moment. All other kinds of trainings, like staff meetings, whether at the building level or the district level. And so Dr. McKinney was very gracious in giving me all that information so I could see agendas and all sorts of things that were going on at various different meetings, teacher meetings, administrator meetings, et cetera. Okay. The handbooks, right? Everybody has handbooks. Different staff groups have handbooks. I looked at all those handbooks for compliance and consistency. So that was part of all of that. And then, of course, under policy AC and policy ACA specifically, there is a grievance policy, a grievance procedure. So if someone feels like there's some kind of discrimination or harassment issue, they file a formal grievance. And so there have been formal grievances that have been filed in the past, and Dr. McKinney was kind enough to show me all of that information as well so I could see what the practices are and procedures and how that conforms to the written policies and procedures. I also interviewed district administrators, and this happened in July. So Dr. McKinney was very gracious to find some building administrators for me to interview, and so we'll get to that later. One of the big items I just want to point, I got a big star on my outline here, is that last item in bold there that you can see, and I'll just read it. This is just my opinion. Everything that you see in italics in these presentations, by the way, it's just my opinion from the findings in there. And so I just want to note that the fact the district, Dr. McKinney and Dr. Lake, as the administrators specifically that contacted me, that they wanted an outside independent audit related to current practices and procedures surrounding typically delicate and sensitive areas demonstrates a desire to provide a safe and productive environment for all stakeholders. You're going to notice that kind of as a theme as we go through here. Lindbergh, it's just as I found through here, Lindbergh, the administrators are doing a very commendable job as it relates to all this. And so as we go through here, I just want to point that out. as well. Next slide. Okay, now this is the bread and butter, so to speak, right? What are the findings? What are my recommendations? So first, I just want to run through really quick the policy pieces, right? So policy AC, this is one of those required training pieces in there. You see on the slide the big training session. This one is for all staff, all employees of the district have a training requirement under policy AC. So what then did I find as it relates to that? Next slide, please. So here are just some specific recommendations that I made as I looked at the mandatory annual trainings, which by and large is meets the requirement for policy AC. A lot of the annual trainings centered around sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and use those terms in the trainings. Policy AC is a little broader than just sexual harassment. It's harassment in general, it's discrimination, and it's retaliation. And so one of the recommendations there would be just to note those broadening in some of the trainings. Provide the consequences in the training, although I didn't read that paragraph, right, about the training in there. It says that the staff employees should know the consequences under policy AC. And so that's not really, I didn't see any of that in the mandatory training. So as one piece to include. And then the complaint procedure, have an official grievance form would be a recommendation there. There's lots of ways, lots of people submit things, email. That would be kind of an official thing that you would have to act on regardless, but having an official form, so to speak, might be a good idea as it relates to that. And then the final part down there, which I know Dr. McKinney has already been working on as we were kind of going through things, I know he was working on this piece, is to have investigator, mainly the investigators under policy AC would be the administrators, right, the building administrators. And so to have ongoing training just to make sure everyone's on the same page with how to conduct things and communicate and all of that. Next slide, please. Next big policy, ACA. This is the Title IX compliance policy. Just as a note, Title IX, right, is from the federal guidelines, and it seems to change on a fairly regular basis. This is actually a newer policy just in the last few years. You've probably already had 2 or 3 different changes in it, recommended changes by your policy provider, MSBA. And so the training piece here in policy ACA basically focuses on those people identified in the process of policy ACA. So you can see up there, those would be the coordinators, right, the Title IX coordinator, the investigators, decision makers. It's a long policy that names the duties of all that, and so that's what the training centers around for ACA. Next slide, please. And so what are the recommendations around ACA? That would be none, right? The annual mandatory trainings that exist address policy ACA and Title IX very well. So I didn't really have any recommendations there outside of just keeping that updated as the moving target that we call Title IX advances along. Next slide, please. Policy GBH, this is staff-student relations. This is the title of this policy, and you can see there's a training requirement here as well. The recommendation here, again, the training pretty much addresses that requirement. The annual mandatory training pretty much addresses that requirement. Just here, there happens to be a specific term that's used, that's referenced between policies, it's sexual abuse. And just to note that term to be consistent between the policies with the definitions there. Would be the only recommendation that I could find as it related to that. Next slide, please. This is just a slide that captures some of the additional trainings I referenced that Dr. McKinney provided me information on. And in all these trainings here, this is, as the next slide says, this is above and beyond what the annual mandatory requirement is. Now, just as a note, I go into a lot of school districts, been in a lot of school districts across the state, actually looking at various things like this. Lindbergh is unique in the fact that you go way above and beyond the training requirements as it relates to policy AC and policy ACA awareness. Okay. Next slide, please. Reference there. So specific recommendations as it relates to all that would be just to make sure that there's consistent information all to every group and that it's consistent across all the different policies. Note the general complaint procedures. Obviously, anybody can go to the policy and see the general complaint procedures, but it might be worthwhile to summarize that, especially as it relates to the staff. Designated coordinators, there was a very good job accomplished about identifying the Title IX compliance coordinator, but not the policy AC coordinator, which actually happens to be from the staff and student perspective, both the same person. But just noting that in there might be good about who to contact, especially for policy AC. Okay. And then again, we already mentioned this, just to repeat, identifying the consequences for violating the policies in a very overt way. Okay. Next slide, please. Handbooks that I looked at on this slide. Next one, please. Recommendations for handbooks. This looks like a lot, and this looks like the handbooks might be terrible if you just look at this. That's not the case. It's kind of just a repeat of some of the other recommendations. Just consistency across there. Make sure all different employee and support staff groups have handbooks. A coach sponsor specific handbook, especially for out-of-district coaches. One of the big things I've seen in the last couple of years is the coaching, the activities, the extracurricular activities, especially as it relates to policy ACA, which is the Title IX compliance. So just having something there would be good to help head that off. Again, same information in there, coordinators, complaint procedures, et cetera. One of the recommendations I made on here that you can see at the end is to have your handbooks actively accepted by the different employee groups and the different employees every year. It kind of gets away from the idea that say, well, handbook, what handbook? So to accomplish that would be one of the big recommendations here. Next slide, please. Administrator interviews. I just want to, again, commend, I was very impressed, right, with the administrators. And I don't say that lightly. Dr. McKinney kind of knows me from my HR days, right? And I don't hand out compliments like candy. So when I say I was impressed, that says something. So you should be proud of that as a district. The building administrators seemed very competent and very skilled at doing investigations and collaborating. They were very complimentary of the district level staff that they reported to, supervisors that they had an issue they went to, and they collaboratively worked it out. And so I just wanted to note that here in the presentation. Next slide, please. So recommendations, as I was getting information and quizzing the building administrators, who were very gracious to come in and give up some of their summer days at the buildings. Again, just the training piece to make sure all the administrators are on the same page, especially for new administrators that come in the district. That's the bottom bullet there. And these are just really kind of very proactive things. And I know Dr. McKinney is very interested in being as proactive as possible. So create an investigation documentation protocol and checklist, kind of just that things, okay, I have a formal complaint or even an informal complaint. What do I do? What are the things to do? Who should I contact? What should I do? You know, as a building administrator would be one of the recommendations here on this one. Also, at the very bottom one there, at that little paragraph, you'll see a little note about Children's Division. So all school district employees are mandated reporters under the law. So if they see some issue, they actually have to report it to Children's Division. They call it the hotline call, right? And so over time, and the annual mandatory trainings, that piece is very clear. There's a whole mandated reporting piece that all the staff sees. But just to go over that and make sure everyone's on the same page on a, not necessarily an annual basis, but maybe in person at staff meetings too, would be a recommendation I would have there. Next slide, please. This is just a little piece about those prior formal complaints that were received by the district. They date it back to 2009 to the present. Just want to note a couple of items here. So a couple of those that actually information was received by the district about complaints from 20 and 25 years ago. And so in my experience, right, looking at school districts, many school districts would say, what do you want me to do with that, right, 20 and 25? I mean, the person or the issue is so old, like, who can I even find? Like, most staff members would be retired, not all, but maybe some of them. And I just want to note for you that all of that was taken immensely seriously by the district and investigated even 25 years in the past to the extent possible. And that was very clear as I went through the documents and the investigation files and all of that. And so I just wanted to note that. I don't know of very many human resource people in school districts that would go through that level of scrutiny for a 25-year-old report. Okay. Next slide. And so the general recommendation there, I don't really have any other than maybe just having kind of specific and set documentation as you go through it. You know, in other words, there's a formal complaint, what's kind of the intake? You know, all that kind of, from a staff perspective, goes through human resources, or for a student perspective, might go through the academics side, right? And so just kind of having a set thing there, that way it's consistent across the district. Again, that's a very proactive thing. Next slide. Conclusions. Well, these are more accolades, time for more accolades. I found that very collaborative. There's an issue, concern that comes up, it's taken seriously, number one. Number two, it's investigated immediately and in a timely manner, and very collaboratively from the building level to the district level. One of the better districts I've seen in regards to all of that, how they handle that, how they take it seriously, how they process that, and the recommendations and things that I made would just, again, take you to the kind of that proactive place. I just want to say that, again, I was very impressed with what I saw and how things operate in the school district. And I will just close there and take any questions you might have.
Anyone? Okay, well, thank you.
Anyone?
very
No
much.
questions? Are you?
Well, now when you compliment us.
Let me off the, well, I don't, like I said, don't take that lightly. You're doing a very good job as it relates to this and keeping students and staff safe, which is the bottom line of those policies, right?
So actually, I do have one.
Sure.
You mentioned for policy AC that we should list the consequences. That says you should be aware of what they are, but it wasn't listed what they are. Were the consequences listed in the handbooks?
No.
Okay.
No, to be consistent and put those in the handbooks and make them aware, even in the annual mandatory trainings too, would be a recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Any other questions? No, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you.